There is a night in human history that should make every person who has ever stood inside a library, a museum, or a place of extraordinary beauty feel something close to physical pain. It was not a natural disaster. It was not an accident. It was a decision made by a drunk man at a party, surrounded by people who should have known better, in the flickering torchlight of the greatest palace complex ever built by human hands. And in the hours that followed that decision, something was lost that no archaeologist, no historian, and no amount of careful reconstruction will ever fully restore to the world. We are talking about Persepolis. And here is what should genuinely unsettle you. The man who ordered it burned was not a barbarian. He was not an ignorant destroyer who failed to understand what he was erasing. He was Alexander of Macedon, the most educated military mind of the ancient world, a student of Aristotle, a man who carried a copy of Homer on every campaign and slept with it under his pillow. He knew exactly what Persepolis was. He knew exactly what it represented. And according to the historians who were there, when the flames finally caught and the columns began to glow against the night sky, Alexander watched the fire he had started and wept. How does a civilization build something so perfect that even the man who destroys it cannot bear to watch it burn? How does 5,000 years of Persian genius get reduced to ash in a single night? And why, 2,300 years later, do those ruins still have the power to stop us completely? This is that story. To understand what Persepolis was, you first have to understand the world that made it possible. Because Persepolis did not appear from nowhere. It was not the vanity project of a single ambitious king. It was the physical culmination of 2 centuries of the most sophisticated imperial experiment the ancient world had ever witnessed. And to understand that experiment, you have to go back to one man. A man who changed the definition of what an empire was allowed to be. Cyrus the Great. In 550 BC, he united the Persian and Median tribes and began building something that had never existed before. Not just a large territory under a single ruler, but a genuinely multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual civilization that operated on a principle so radical it would not become mainstream political thinking for another 2,000 years. The principle that conquered peoples deserve dignity, that their gods deserve respect, that their cultures deserve protection rather than erasure. His successors carried that vision forward with remarkable consistency. Cambyses conquered Egypt and incorporated it into the empire without dismantling its ancient religious institutions. Darius I expanded the borders from the Indus Valley in the east to Libya in the west, bringing nearly 50 million people, half the population of the entire Earth at that moment, under a single administrative system of extraordinary sophistication. Royal roads that connected the empire's furthest corners. A postal system so fast that messages traveled thousands of miles in days. Gold coins that standardized trade across 3 continents. Persepolis was where all of that power came to rest, where it built itself a home worthy of what it had become. In 518 BC, Darius I stood on a rocky mountain terrace in the Fars region of southwestern Iran and made a decision that would echo through human history for 2.5 millennia. He had already built an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the shores of the Mediterranean. He had already reformed its laws, reorganized its administration, and stabilized its finances. He had already done, by any reasonable measure, enough. But Darius understood something that purely military rulers never do. An empire without a physical expression of its own greatness is an empire that has not yet fully believed in itself. He was going to build that expression, and he was going to build it here. What rose from that rocky terrace over the following decades was not a city in the conventional sense. It was a statement, a deliberate architectural argument made in stone and cedar and gold for the proposition that Persian civilization was not merely powerful, but cosmically ordained. The terrace itself was leveled and expanded to a platform of nearly 125,000 square meters. A monumental staircase, so precisely engineered that its steps were shallow enough for horses to climb while carrying riders, led upward to a complex of palaces, throne rooms, and ceremonial halls that had no equal anywhere on Earth. The Apadana, Darius's great audience hall, stood on a forest of 72 columns, each one 20 meters tall, each one topped with sculptures of bulls and eagles that carried the weight of cedar roofs imported from Lebanon at enormous expense. The Gate of All Nations, completed by his son Xerxes, stood at the entrance to the complex with massive stone bulls flanking its doorway, and an inscription carved in 3 languages announcing that all the peoples of the world were welcome here. And the workers who built it were not slaves. This is the detail that stops historians cold every time they encounter it. The tens of thousands of laborers who constructed Persepolis were paid in silver, on a payroll system so organized that the clay tablets recording their wages still exist today, sitting in museum collections, waiting for people to understand what they are looking at. Persepolis was not built by fear. It was built by a civilization that had decided to show the world exactly what it was capable of when it chose to be generous rather than brutal. And what it was capable of was something the world had never seen before and has never quite seen again. There are places in history that become more than places. They become ideas. They become the physical address of a civilization's highest ambition, the point on the map where everything that culture believed about itself was made visible, tangible, and permanent. Persepolis, at the height of Achaemenid power, was exactly that kind of place. And what happened there every year, in the days surrounding the Persian New Year of Nowruz, was something so extraordinary that the stone carvings left behind to record it still stop people in their tracks 2,500 years later. Every spring, representatives from every nation under Persian rule made the journey to Persepolis. Not as prisoners, not as tribute bearers marching in humiliation, but as delegations, as recognized peoples bringing the products of their own civilizations to the center of the empire that had chosen to include rather than erase them. The Apadana staircase reliefs, carved with a precision and a humanity that has no parallel in ancient art, show them in procession. 23 nations, Lydians carrying golden vessels, Armenians leading a horse, Indians bringing axes and a donkey, Ethiopians with an okapi, Babylonians with cloth and vessels. Each delegation carved with distinct clothing, distinct hairstyles, distinct facial features. Each one rendered not as a conquered subject, but as a people with a specific identity worth recording in stone for eternity. This was the Persian idea of empire. Not uniformity, not the erasure of difference, but the collection and celebration of difference under a single administrative canopy sophisticated enough to hold it all together. And the administrative sophistication of Persepolis was, in itself, almost impossible to believe given the era in which it existed. Archaeologists excavating the site discovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, recording the economic activity of the empire in extraordinary detail. Workers at Persepolis received monthly rations of grain and wine, calculated according to their skill level and their family size. Skilled craftsmen received higher allocations. Supervisors received more than laborers. And in a detail that has genuinely shocked every historian who has encountered it, female workers who were pregnant or who had recently given birth received increased rations, a maternity benefit. In 500 BC, 2,500 years before most modern nations thought to legislate such a thing, the Greco-Persian Wars, the ones that Western history has traditionally told as a story of heroic Greek resistance against Persian tyranny, look entirely different when viewed from Persepolis. Yes, Darius sent armies to Greece. Yes, Xerxes burned Athens. But for the vast Achaemenid Empire, Greece was a peripheral concern, a border irritation. The real story was happening here, on this terrace, where the most diverse and most administratively sophisticated civilization on Earth was quietly going about the business of running half the known world with a competence that its Greek contemporaries could barely imagine and would spend centuries trying to understand. Persepolis at its peak was not just the capital of an empire, it was the proof that human civilization was capable of something better than conquest and domination. It was the argument, made in stone and cedar, and the careful records of workers paid fairly for their labor, that power and generosity were not opposites, that an empire could be both dominant and humane, that the world's greatest city could be built not by slaves, but by people who were paid to be there. That argument burned on a single night in 330 BC, and the world has been arguing about it ever since. But history, as it always does, had other plans. And the cracks that would eventually bring down the most sophisticated empire the ancient world had ever produced did not appear suddenly or dramatically. They appeared the way all fatal cracks appear in structures that seem too strong to fail. Quietly, gradually, in places that no one was paying close enough attention to until it was far too late to repair them. It began with Xerxes, the king who had completed Persepolis, who had added the Gate of All Nations and the Hall of 100 Columns, and stamped his own vision onto the greatest architectural complex on Earth, made a catastrophic miscalculation in 480 BC. He personally led the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled into Greece, certain that the sheer scale of Persian power would overwhelm whatever resistance the fractious Greek city-states could organize. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and their allies held his army for 3 days. At Salamis, the Greek navy destroyed the Persian fleet in a narrow strait where Persian numerical superiority became a liability rather than an advantage. Xerxes' return to Persepolis diminished in a way that no military defeat alone could fully explain. The myth of Persian invincibility, the psychological foundation on which the entire empire rested, had developed its first visible fracture. What followed was a slow dynastic unraveling that spanned a century and a half. Xerxes was assassinated by his own courtiers. His successors came to power through palace coups rather than legitimate succession. The satraps, the regional governors who administered the empire's vast territories, began accumulating independent power, running their provinces as personal kingdoms and sending increasingly unreliable loyalty back to the center. The army that had once been the most feared military force on Earth became dependent on Greek mercenaries to fill its ranks. An empire that had been built on the principle of including and elevating the peoples it governed was now paying foreigners to defend it. And somewhere in Macedonia, a young man who had memorized every Persian weakness was sharpening his sword. In 334 BC, Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont into Persian territory, with an army of approximately 40,000 men and a mission that he had been preparing for his entire life. His father Philip had dreamed of it. His tutor Aristotle had shaped his mind for it. And Alexander himself had decided, with the absolute certainty of a 22-year-old who had never lost a battle, that the Persian Empire was not an eternal civilization, but a problem waiting to be solved. What followed was 3 of the most consequential military campaigns in human history. At the Granicus River in 334 BC, Alexander's cavalry shattered the Persian frontier forces in a battle so fast and so decisive that it barely registers as a contest. At Issus in 333 BC, he met Darius III himself, commanding a Persian army that vastly outnumbered his own, and destroyed it so completely that Darius fled the battlefield on horseback, abandoning his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his treasury to the advancing Macedonians. Alexander treated the captured Persian royal family with a courtesy and a respect that surprised everyone who witnessed it, because Alexander understood something crucial. He was not coming to destroy Persia. He was coming to inherit it. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, the final confrontation, Darius assembled every remaining resource of the empire for one last stand. He had scythed chariots. He had war elephants. He had a numerical advantage so overwhelming that his generals believed it was impossible to lose. Alexander broke his center with a cavalry charge of such precise, controlled violence that the Persian formation collapsed in minutes. Darius fled again, and this time he would not stop fleeing until his own generals murdered him in the desert to prevent his capture. Alexander marched into Persepolis in January of 330 BC. What he found there exceeded even what his education had prepared him to expect. The treasury alone contained 120,000 talents of silver, an amount so staggering that it required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport it out of the city. He garrisoned the palaces. He posted guards at the treasury. For several weeks, Persepolis remained intact, the greatest architectural achievement on Earth, sitting in the careful hands of its new Macedonian master. And then came the night that changed everything. The accounts differ in their details, but agree on the essential shape of what happened. There was a celebration. There was wine, a great deal of wine. And there was a woman named Thais, an Athenian courtesan who had traveled with Alexander's court, who stood up in the flickering torchlight and made a suggestion. Athens had been burned by Xerxes 150 years earlier, the greatest act of cultural vandalism in Greek memory. Was it not fitting, she asked, that Persia's greatest palace should answer for that crime tonight? Alexander picked up a torch. His companions followed. And Persepolis, the city that had taken decades to build, the city whose columns had touched the clouds, whose staircase reliefs had recorded the faces of 23 nations in stone, whose clay tablets had documented the wages of workers paid fairly for their extraordinary labor, burned through the night until there was nothing left but ash and the blackened stumps of columns that had once held up the roof of the world. But here is what history almost always forgets to tell you about that night. Alexander regretted it almost immediately. Ancient sources record that he gave the order to extinguish the flames before the destruction was complete. Too late to save the palaces, but revealing something important about the man who had started the fire. And in the months and years that followed, Alexander did something that no conqueror of Persia was supposed to do. He became Persian. He adopted Persian court dress. He incorporated Persian nobles into his administration. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess from the eastern edges of the former Persian Empire. He encouraged his generals to marry Persian women. He began performing Persian royal rituals that his Macedonian companions found deeply offensive. The man who had burned Persepolis spent the rest of his short life trying to become the thing he had destroyed. The conqueror had been absorbed by the civilization he had conquered. The Iranian pattern, that extraordinary cultural gravity that pulled every invader into its orbit and remade them in its own image, had claimed Alexander of Macedon, just as it would later claim the Arabs and the Mongols and every other force that believed it had finally, permanently, put Persia to rest. The fire lasted one night. The pool of Persian civilization has never gone out. Today, if you travel to the Fars region of southwestern Iran, about 60 kilometers northeast of the city of Shiraz, you will find something that does not behave the way ruins are supposed to behave. Ruins are supposed to feel dead. They are supposed to communicate absence, the silence of things that no longer exist, the melancholy of civilizations that ran their course and stopped. Persepolis does not feel like that. Standing on that ancient terrace, looking at the columns that still reach toward the sky, reading the faces of the 23 nations carved into the Apadana staircase with a specificity and a humanity that no photograph fully captures, you do not feel like you are visiting the past. You feel like you are standing in the middle of an argument that has not yet been resolved. In 1971, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, held an extraordinary celebration at Persepolis, marking 2,500 years of Persian imperial tradition. Heads of state from across the world were invited. Tents of extraordinary luxury were erected on the ancient terrace. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. We are the inheritors of this. This magnificent continuity belongs to us. 8 years later, the Islamic Revolution erased the Shah and everything he represented. The new government had complicated feelings about Persepolis, a pre-Islamic monument to a pre-Islamic civilization. But they did not destroy it. They could not destroy it. Because Persepolis is not a monument to a dynasty, or a religion, or a political system. It is a monument to the Iranian idea itself. To the proposition that this civilization, this particular way of organizing human life and human creativity, is worth preserving against every force that has ever tried to erase it. Alexander's fire lasted one night. Persepolis has been burning in the human imagination for 2,300 years, and it shows no sign of going out.